I wasn't looking for buried cities when I started this investigation. I was researching the architectural funding anomalies of mid-19th century Europe, specifically how cities like Vienna, Budapest, and St. Petersburg managed to construct enormous, ornately carved civic buildings during periods of documented financial collapse and widespread famine. That was the original question. A dry, administrative question about ledger books and construction contracts. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that should have led me here. But then I came across a series of survey photographs taken by municipal engineers in Brussels in 1891. They were documenting routine drainage work, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure project that fills municipal archives with hundreds of unremarkable images. Except these images were not unremarkable. In several of them, the workers digging the drainage trenches were standing in the excavation at shoulder height, standard enough. But the walls behind them, the exterior foundation walls of buildings that, according to every official record, had been constructed between 1750 and 1820, those walls continued downward, not into raw earth, not into rough stone footings, into finished carved dressed stonework, decorative cornices, arched window surrounds, intact plaster molding, all buried, all below the current street level, all belonging to a building that, officially, had no subterranean floors. I set aside the ledger books. I set aside the funding question, because a new question had replaced it, and I couldn't let it go. If those buildings were only ever 1 story tall above ground, as every official architectural record insists, then were the finished, inhabited rooms doing 12 feet underground? That was the moment the official explanations began to collapse. Let me take you to the photographs first, because that is always where I begin. Not theories, not speculation. Photographs. The Brussels Drainage Survey of 1891 is held in the Archives de la Ville de Bruxelles, catalogued under Public Works. Series 7, Reference Group D. I have spent considerable time with reproductions of these images, and several details demand serious attention. In Photograph D, 7-114, a team of 4 workers stands in a trench approximately 11 feet deep. The trench runs along the western facade of a building on the Rue de Sablons that city records identify as having been completed in 1803. The above-ground portion of this building is 3 stories of dressed limestone with carved neoclassical detailing, pilasters, dentil molding, carved keystones above each window. Standard for the period. Unremarkable. What is not unremarkable is what the trench reveals below the current street level. The limestone coursing continues downward with no interruption, no change in material, no change in quality of dressing. What appears to be a window arch, complete carved with an intact stone surround, is visible at approximately 9 feet below grade. The arch is not rough. It is not unfinished. It is not a structural foundation element. It is a window into a room that is entirely underground. The official explanation for this, when any explanation is offered at all, is that the street level in Brussels rose gradually due to centuries of accumulated debris, refuse, and deliberate fill. This is a standard archaeological explanation. It is applied routinely to ancient sites, to Rome, to Istanbul, to Jerusalem. The accumulation model suggests that through ordinary human habitation, street levels rise at roughly 1 to 2 feet per century. This is a legitimate, well-documented process. But here is where the explanation begins to fail. If we accept the accumulation model for Brussels, and we work backwards from a documented street-level rise of 9 to 12 feet, we are looking at an accumulation period of between 400 and 1,200 years. The buildings currently standing, the ones of the buried lower floors, are officially 200 years old at most. They cannot have been standing long enough to accumulate 12 feet of street-level rise through ordinary debris. The mathematics do not reconcile. The grain of those photographs, the sharp, consistent shadows falling correctly for a mid-morning exposure in northern Belgium, the undisturbed plaster still visible on the buried interior window reveals. All of it predates any technology that could fake them. These are what they appear to be. I found the same pattern in Strasbourg. Municipal sewage work conducted in 1887 along the Rue du Vieux-Marché aux Vins revealed intact, lower-level facades of buildings officially constructed in the 1760s. The buried portion included a carved door surrounded with fluted pilasters and a broken pediment. an expensive decorative element that no builder would place on a foundation wall, never intended to be seen. In Edinburgh, drainage surveys from 1893 along the Royal Mile document finished stonework at depths between 8 and 14 feet below current grade, belonging to buildings whose above-ground construction is dated no earlier than the 1780s. In Prague, in Ghent, in Porto, the same evidence, the same depths, the same discrepancy between official construction dates and the physical reality buried beneath every street. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern does not stay in Belgium. That is what makes it impossible to dismiss as local anomaly, as regional geological quirk, as anything other than what it appears to be. In St. Petersburg, a city whose official founding date is 1703, the construction records for the Winter Palace and the surrounding imperial precinct describe foundations laid on timber piles driven into marshy ground, standard practice for the Neva Delta. But survey work conducted for the city's underground canal system in 1880 documented something the official foundation records do not account for. Along the Moika embankment at depths between 10 and 16 feet below the current canal side walkway, workers encountered dressed stone walls running parallel to the existing building facades. The stone was granite. The dressing was fine ashlar work. The joints were tight. It was not rubble. It was not rough fill. It was a wall built to be seen. In Buenos Aires, excavations for the extension of the Avenida de Mayo in 1894 revealed arch brick vaulting at depth of 8 to 11 feet below grade. Vaulting whose style the supervising engineer described his report as consistent with Spanish colonial construction of the 17th century, predating the city's own official founding documentation by decades. In Delhi, British colonial survey work along Chandni Chowk in 1878 encountered finished stone coursing at depths that, by any reasonable accumulation calculation, implied a street-level rise far exceeding anything the official occupation timeline of the Mogul city could explain. In Lahore and Lima, in Cape Town, the same depths, the same finished stonework, the same impossible arithmetic. The measurements repeat with unsettling precision. The buried floor levels cluster consistently between 8 and 16 feet below current grade. Not 2 feet, not 30 feet, 8 to 16. Across continents, across climates, across what official history insists are entirely independent urban traditions. The proportion is too consistent. The depth is too uniform. The quality of the buried construction is too high. These are not basements, not service tunnels, not utilitarian foundation work. They are finished rooms, finished facades, finished streets, and they are everywhere. The buildings above them, the ones we are told represent the beginning of these cities, share another quality that the geographical pattern makes undeniable. They share style, not merely a period style, not simply the broad category of neoclassical or Baroque influence spreading across trade routes. They share specific proportions, specific ornamental vocabularies, specific ratios between column diameter and intercolumnar spacing that recur with precision no informal stylistic transmission could produce. The ratio between the height of a first-floor window and the total facade height in buildings from St. Petersburg to Buenos Aires to Delhi falls within a range so narrow that, statistically, it implies either a single directing intelligence or the inheritance of a single prior tradition. Who were they built for? On maps produced between 1650 and 1800, maps held today in the British Museum, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in the Library of Congress, there appears a territorial designation covering an enormous portion of Eurasian landmass. It stretches from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast of Asia, and in its various iterations encompasses regions that today we know as Siberia, Central Asia, northern China, and significant portions of Eastern Europe. The designation reads, in various languages and spellings, as Tartaria, or Tartary, or Grand Tartary. Not a legend, not a myth, not a cartographic shorthand for unknown territory. It appears on maps produced by Guillaume Delisle, by Hermann Moll, by Tobias Conrad Lauder, serious cartographers working with serious geographic intelligence, producing maps for governments, for military commands, for colonial administrations that needed accurate information. It appears with internal subdivisions, independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. It appears with cities marked, with rivers named, with boundaries drawn with the same confidence applied to France or England or the Ottoman Empire. And then, with a consistency that becomes impossible to ignore, it disappears. Not gradually, not through the ordinary cartographic process by which territories are renamed, reorganized, absorbed into successor states. By 1820, by 1830 at the latest, the name is gone. The territory described has been parceled out among Russia, China, and emerging Central Asian designations of colonial cartography. The cities it contained have been renamed or relocated on the new maps. The civilization it implied, a civilization large enough, organized enough, and well-documented enough to appear on every serious European map for 150 years, has been assigned no history, no archaeology, no successor culture, no founding mythology. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. And here is where the connection to the buried walls becomes impossible to ignore. The territory of Tartaria, as mapped in its fullest extent during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, overlaps precisely with the geographical distribution of the buried construction anomalies. St. Petersburg sits on the western edge of what the 1720 maps call Muscovite Tartary. The Central Asian cities with their buried facades fall within its core territory. Even in Western Europe, in Brussels, in Strasbourg, in Prague, we are looking at cities that sat on the active trade and administrative frontier Tartarian influence during the period when those buried structures were inhabited. The architecture of the buried lower levels, the architectural vocabulary of the buildings now standing on top of them, and the stylistic consistency stretching from St. Petersburg to Buenos Aires, all of it points toward a single originating tradition, a tradition that was not Roman, not Greek, not the product of the Renaissance workshops we are taught to credit, a tradition that the maps, before they were revised, attributed to a civilization the revised maps chose to forget. The academic literature on these buried facades is, with very few exceptions, silent. But the popular press of the 19th century was not always so carefully managed. And in the newspaper archives, in the municipal libraries, in the bound volumes of regional weeklies that were never considered important enough to systematically destroy, the record is more candid. The Edinburgh Civic Register, 1893, reporting on the drainage excavations along the Royal Mile, a staff correspondent describes the discovery of an entire street frontage of dressed stone, complete with window openings and what appear to be a painted interior surface, at a depth of some 12 feet beneath the current roadway, and notes that the supervising engineer expresses inability to account for the deposit within the known construction history of the city. The Strasbourg Municipal Gazette, 1888, in a brief item on the Rue du Vieux-Martin sewer work. Workmen engaged in laying new pipe infrastructure encountered, at approximately 9 feet below grade, the remains of what several observers described as an intact building interior, with plastered walls and evidence of decorative painting still adhering in protected sections. The Buenos Aires Herald, 1894, in a longer feature on the Avenida de Mayo extension project. The correspondent quotes the supervising engineer directly, expressing bewilderment at the presence of substantial brick vaulting of considerable age predating any construction the city's official records could account for, and suggesting the matter warranted formal archaeological investigation before further excavation proceeded. No formal archaeological investigation was ever recorded as having taken place. The Prague Illustrated Weekly, 1901, covering routine maintenance work in the Old Town. Our correspondent reports that workmen engaged beneath the Stairmast Mesti have uncovered what appears to be a lower-level arcade of considerable craftsmanship, the style of which one architectural authority consulted by this paper described as inconsistent with any known period of the city's documented construction. The Lahore Civil and Military Gazette, 1899, in a brief notice on colonial survey work near the Delhi Gate. The survey party reports the presence of finished masonry at depths exceeding those attributable to the known Mughal construction sequence, a circumstance the department intends to examine further in due course. The reports stop after approximately 1920. The photographs stop. The newspaper notices stop. The municipal survey reports that had, for 40 years, been casually noting buried construction anomalies as items of local curiosity, simply ceased to mention them. Not because the excavation stopped. Urban infrastructure work continued and accelerated to the 20th century. Not because the anomalies ceased to appear, because the procedure for handling them changed. After 1920, the standard municipal protocol, consistent across every city I have been able to document, is to record only what fits the official construction timeline. What does not fit is categorized as disturbed fill or redeposited rubble and passed over without description. What changed after 1920? What institution, what coordinating body, what shared professional consensus decided that these discoveries were no longer items of public curiosity, but items requiring administrative silence? The Smithsonian's Archive of International Correspondence from the period 1918 to 1935 contains a number of letters exchanged with European municipal survey departments on matters the catalog describes only as stratigraphic consistency protocols. The actual letters are not available for public review. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the cities we believe we built in the 18th and 19th centuries were not built in the 18th and 19th centuries? What if the construction projects documented in the official records, the contracts, the architect's drawings, the cornerstone ceremonies, the dedication speeches, were not the creation of these buildings, but the renovation and partial repurposing of buildings that already existed? What if the buried lower floors are not buried because street levels rose through centuries of debris accumulation? What if they are buried because something deposited material across the entire surface of inhabited regions with extraordinary speed? A flood, not of water alone, but the silicate-rich, mineral-laden, densely packed material that geologists and soil scientists, when they describe it all, tend to call loess or alluvial deposit, or, in the informal language that occasionally surfaces in pre-1920 survey reports, mud, a mud event, a rapid deposition event covering significant portions of the inhabited world with between 8 and 16 feet of material, not a local flood, a continental or global event, one that buried the lower floors of every inhabited building across a civilization that stretched from Western Europe through Central Asia and beyond, one that killed or displaced the population that had lived in those buildings, one that was followed, within a generation, by a new population moving into the structures that remained above the mudline, finding finished buildings, intact facades, carved stonework, and simply moving in, adapting them, lowering the ceilings, adding internal partitions, and then, crucially, constructing official history that credited themselves with building what they had inherited. Why would that history be constructed? Why would the survivors or the inheritors or whoever administered the recovery erase the civilization that preceded them? Because inheritance is not the same as conquest. Because a population that moves into existing buildings has no founding story. Because the political and religious legitimacy of the states that emerged in the early 19th century, the unified nation-states, the colonial empires, the constitutional monarchies, required origin narratives that began with themselves. A prior civilization, global in its reach, architectural in its ambition, erased by a geological event they had no part in causing, that civilization's existence would have been, for the new order, an inconvenience too large to manage. So they managed it the only way available to them. They buried the records as thoroughly as the mud had buried the floors. When I have brought this evidence to professional historians, and I have, on several occasions, in academic contexts where I had reason to expect serious engagement, the response follows a pattern so consistent as become, in itself, a kind of evidence. They do not argue. They do not produce counter-evidence. They do not point to a study that resolves the photographic anomalies, that explains the newspaper accounts, that accounts for the buried window arches with mechanism that fits the official timeline. They change the subject. They express polite concern about the quality of the sources. They reference, without specifics, the broad consensus of professional archaeology. And then they move on. They don't debate. They pretend it never existed. This is not, I want to be clear, a claim of active conspiratorial suppression in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and, in many ways, more effective. It is the operation of professional consensus as a filtering mechanism. Junior researchers learn, not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulated signals of career advancement and academic approval, which questions are permissible and which are not. The question of why finished, inhabited rooms are buried 12 feet below European city streets is not a permissible question. not because anyone has formally prohibited it, because the question, followed seriously, leads to conclusions that the entire architecture of professional historical and archaeological knowledge is built to prevent. It's not active suppression, it's passive erasure. And the erasure is not new. The newspaper record I described, the casual, curious mid-Victorian press coverage of buried anomalies, dried up precisely as the professional disciplines of archaeology and urban history were institutionalizing. The period from 1880 to 1920 saw the establishment of professional archaeological associations, the formalization of stratigraphic methodology, the creation of the academic infrastructure through which all claims about the past would thereafter be filtered. It is precisely in this period that the rules about what counts as evidence, what counts as an anomaly, and what counts as disturbed fill were written. The timing is not coincidental. Across disciplines, geology, architecture, history, soil science, the same filtering operates. A geologist who notes unusual characteristics in loess deposits across Central Europe frames it as a sedimentology question and publishes in a sedimentology journal, where it is read by sedimentologists and never crosses the desk of an urban historian. An architectural historian who notes the stylistic consistency across geographically separated neoclassical buildings attributes it to pattern books and traveling architects and never asks whether the buildings might share an origin more direct than aesthetic influence. The disciplines are separated precisely so that no one is positioned to see the whole picture. I have tried to discuss this in academic circles. I have learned what happens. The conversation ends. There is one more category of evidence I need to address, because it's the one I find most difficult to explain away, and the one I have seen most consistently dismissed with labels that, on examination, explain nothing. The window ironwork. In the ground floor windows at current street level of dozens of buildings across Brussels, Vienna, Prague, and Edinburgh, the iron window grills are positioned in a way that, architecturally, makes no sense. They are installed at heights of between 2 and 4 feet above the current floor level inside the rooms they protect, and between 1 and 3 feet below the external sill level. In a normally configured window opening, the grill sits flush with or slightly proud of the exterior face of the wall, at the midpoint of the opening. In these windows, the grill is interior mounted and low, as though the window opening has been partially blocked from below on the exterior side, with the original sill now buried, and the grill retaining its original position relative to an original floor level that is now underground. The grills themselves are worth examining. Auction catalogs for salvage sales following building renovation in Brussels between 1895 and 1912 describe these ground floor grills repeatedly with measurements that do not correspond to the window openings they supposedly served. A grill measuring. In one 1903 catalog entry, 78 centimeters in height by 112 centimeters in width for a window opening the same entry describes as 54 centimeters of clear glaze height. The grill is taller than the window it protects by almost 25 centimeters. The catalog entry ascribes this to adaptation during renovation. Adaptation during renovation. That phrase, in one form or another, appears in nearly every museum label and auction catalog entry that touches these dimensions. The label closes a question without answering it. But consider what those measurements actually describe. A grill 78 centimeters tall for a current window opening 54 centimeters clear. That 24 centimeter discrepancy is almost exactly the average additional depth you would expect if the original window opening, for which the grill was fabricated, extended 24 centimeters further downward before the current floor deposit buried the bottom of the opening. The grill was not adapted. The window was buried. The grill retained its original dimensions because no one thought to change it. Because when you inherit a building, you keep what works. When I began mapping these grill dimension discrepancies against the depths of buried facades documented in the municipal survey photographs, the numbers aligned within margins that no coincidence could produce. And suddenly the ironwork isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I began this investigation with ledger books, with a dry question of how 19th century European cities paid for their civic architecture during periods of documented economic hardship. That question has not been answered, but has been reframed by everything I have found since, because the answer to the funding question may be simpler and stranger than any economic analysis can resolve. You do not need to fund the construction of a building that already exists. You need to fund only its renovation, its cleaning, its adaptation to new use, its reattribution to a new patron, a fraction of the cost, achievable even in hard times. And politically, the cost of the alternative, the cost of acknowledging that you did not build what you now inhabit, was apparently judged to be far higher. So I am left with the questions. And I don't have definitive answers, only questions. Why do the finished, decorated, inhabited lower floors of buildings across a dozen European cities sit consistently between 8 and 16 feet below current street grade, in structures whose official construction dates cannot mathematically account for that depth of accumulation? Why do the newspaper reports that documented these anomalies for 40 years cease abruptly in a period when professional archaeology was establishing consensus frameworks that would define permissible interpretation? Why does a cartographic record support the existence of a civilization large enough to earn consistent designation on every serious European map for 150 years, only to disappear from the record entirely within a single generation without conquest, without successor culture, without ruins attributed to its name? Why do the window grills not fit the windows they were made to protect? Why does the architectural vocabulary of buildings on 5 continents share proportional relationships too precise for informal stylistic transmission to explain? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies, pattern. A pattern that runs through the soil beneath every old European city, through the archive catalogs that describe measurements without explaining them, through a professional consensus that has learned to stop asking. There is something beneath these streets. There is something in these walls that the walls remember even when the records do not. The buried cornices, the low-mounted grills, the window arches sealed under 12 feet of mineral-rich deposit. They are not going anywhere. They do not require our acknowledgement. They require only that someone, eventually, stop accepting the explanation that explains nothing and begin asking what it is that we have actually inherited. I don't know who built what is beneath our feet. I don't know what erased them or when. I don't know whether the civilization the old maps call Tartaria is the answer or only part of one. But I know that the evidence is there, embedded in the stones of every old city in Europe, patient as the mud that covered it, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look down instead of up. The buildings still stand. The buried floors still remain.